Good evening and welcome to the latest edition of the Amherst Wire UVC TV series, Professors in Politics. My name is Jackson Cote, and I'm joined in the studio tonight by Professor Sheldon Goldman of the UMass Amherst Political Science Department, who is here to talk about civil liberties under the Trump administration, as well as the Supreme Court nomination process of Neil Gorsuch. Professor Goldman started teaching political science at UMass in 1965, and he has been conducting research on and teaching topics such as the politics of selecting and confirming federal judges, and the politics of constitutional law and civil liberties ever since. Professor Goldman is widely considered an expert on the judicial system and has written numerous articles and books on the subject, most notably his 1997 book titled Picking Federal Judges. Thanks for joining us tonight, Professor Goldman.
My pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you in the studio. So I wanted to first ask you about, before we move on to Neil Gorsuch, about civil liberties under the Trump administration, specifically the First Amendment. I know Trump doesn't really have a problem with free speech, as you can see on his Twitter profile, but in terms of freedom of the press, he has consistently attacked the press, mainly the media outlets he doesn't like, calling them fake news, calling them the opposition party. I was wondering if you see this rhetoric as threatening to First Amendment, specifically freedom of the press rights.
Oh, most certainly it is, and it's very dispiriting to have a president of the United States go full force against the press. No president has ever been very happy with the press because if the press is doing its job right, it's going to irritate a president every now and then. But for the President Trump to lambaste the press and reporters and demean and degrade them, and his acolyte Sean Spicer is really mirroring this attitude. That is very discouraging. But the threat is actually to lay the groundwork for general disbelief in what the press is doing. And that, in turn, would enhance the ability of the administration to have its own propaganda machine and to try to influence public opinion, mass opinion, following its own party line. I mean, ironically, this is what a totalitarian system and the Russian system, even today, they don't have a free press the way we have it. Although it's freer than it was under Stalin and the other dictators.
Yeah. Now, with his selection of Neil Gorsuch as the Supreme Court Justice nominee, Judge Gorsuch has been a fervent protector of freedom of speech rights. He has. He's ruled in favor of media outlets in cases of libel against them, as well as in cases where the federal government has tried to search, law enforcement has tried to search reporters' notes and computers. Do you see a divide between the president and his Supreme Court Justice nominee on this front?
Well, I think every Supreme Court Justice who's currently serving or served in the past, I mean, there might be one or two exceptions, but they uphold their oath to support the Constitution, and the Constitution is very clear in terms of Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And along these same lines, the administration, the executive branch, cannot impinge upon freedom of speech and freedom of the press without raising some very serious constitutional issues and questions. So what the position of Judge Gorsuch is on First Amendment rights, I would say is very similar to what almost every, maybe even all the judges, any self-respecting judge, and that's to follow the clear-cut precedent of how you interpret statutes and the Constitution. And the precedents for freedom of the press, freedom of speech and freedom of the press are very clear, very pronounced. And if there is any one value that the Supreme Court, particularly since 1937, has demonstrated has been how important freedom of speech and freedom of the press is. Now, occasionally there's some decisions that are not in favor of the freedom of speech claim or the freedom of the press claim. But the basic precedents are there that generally support these values. So I would be shocked if, for example, Judge Gorsuch were to come out for overturning New York Times versus Sullivan, which was very important in terms of protecting freedom of the press. I would be very shocked if he came out for overturning any of the major First Amendment precedents, the Brandenburg versus Ohio, that set a standard for when government can impinge upon the First Amendment and in terms of freedom of speech. And so it's, I think, important to keep in mind that Judge Gorsuch does adhere to the basic expectations of our judges, particularly in the federal court system. And so in many respects, we like to think of them as these judges as apart from normal politicians, that they're not politicians in robes. On occasion, they will hand down a decision, particularly, Bush versus Gore. I mean, it was a political decision, and the court did suffer in terms of its reputation, at least initially, although it then bounced back. But what you have is the court and the justices, not all of them, but all at the same time, but particularly the Chief Justice, are very concerned about the image of the court as not being too political. That's why Chief Justice John Roberts cast really the decisive vote in upholding the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, because it was quite clear that had he done otherwise, particularly at the start of the campaign season in June of 2012, the Supreme Court would have been a major political issue at the time. It would have done the court a great deal of damage.
Now, you're talking about the Supreme Court being this sort of apolitical entity.
Well, that's the ideal.
That's the idea.
That's the ideal that we would like.
The process for selecting a Supreme Court justice, that's not apolitical. That's very political, and has been, especially this time around with the selection of Neil Gorsuch, and before that, when Obama was trying to get Merrick Garland to be selected.
Well, Merrick Garland,
put this in just historical context for me.
Yeah.
Has it ever been this contentious? Has it ever been this political and traumatic? I mean, USA Today describes Neil Gorsuch as well qualified and within the broad judicial system. However, you see some Democratic senators highly criticizing him, like Al Franken, questioning his judgment. Could you just put this in historical context for us?
Well, in the 19th century, 1 out of every 3 Supreme Court nomination failed to be confirmed. 1 out of 3. Some were never voted on by the Senate. Others were voted and voted down. Some of the reasons were policy-oriented, or we might say today, ideological. Others were in terms of the qualifications and the competence. So we do have to keep this in perspective. In the 20th century, it has been different. The first major controversial Supreme Court nomination was that of Louis Brandeis in 1916 by Democratic President Woodrow Wilson. Now, part of the opposition to Brandeis, who I guess in today's parlance we would consider him to be a populist, a man of the people. He was a defender of the little guy. Brandeis was also opposed because of anti-Semitism. He was the first Jewish nominee to the Supreme Court. And so he was opposed on ideological grounds, he was opposed on religious grounds. And there was a big confirmation battle, but obviously, as you know, he was confirmed and turned out to be, a great justice. Then we really did not come into a period of great controversy over Supreme Court nominees. President Roosevelt was very concerned that his nominees would be supportive of his economic policies, the New Deal, and the social welfare policies. And his first nominee was then Senator Hugo Black, who at the time and in that context was considered to be, a real firebrand. And conservatives hated him, but of course they didn't have the votes in the Senate. And also the Senates, by tradition, usually supported their own. But subsequent appointments were less controversial nationally, but they were ideologically driven, at least in terms of the president's agenda to get people who supported Roosevelt's New Deal program and social welfare agenda. Then Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, is in a sense an outlier in all of this because ideology wasn't important to him. He was more interested in appointing people he knew and trusted. And he wound up by appointing actually conservatives. They were Democrats, but they were conservative. Of course, this was in the era before there was such political polarization that we have now. There's always been ideological polarization, but that hasn't been the same thing as political polarization. So you always had, there were liberal Republicans, there were conservative Democrats. In fact, conservative Democrats held key roles in the United States Senate. It was a struggle for Democratic President Lyndon Johnson to get the conservative, racist Democratic Senator James Eastland, who was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to agree to go along with the nomination of the first African American to the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. But Senator Eastland, was willing to play ball with President Johnson, but he said that in terms of his own politics and his base in Mississippi, his essentially white segregationist base, he had to delay it, for a time. So, but Marshall became a Supreme Court justice, and of course the rest is history.
So right now, it's this sort of hyper-political atmosphere is nothing new?
We've had it before.
Okay.
We've had it before. We've had it before, certainly in terms of ideology. We've had it before to some extent in the 19th century in terms of party, but again, our parties were not as politically polarized in terms of liberal, conservatives, Democrats, liberal, Republicans, conservative. In fact, it's only since the 1970s that you've had a realignment in the South, where the conservative Democrats in the conservative white Democrats in the South then switched over to the Republican Party. Liberal Republicans in the North then switched over to the Democratic Party. We can see in our own congressional district, the member of Congress had always been Republican, because this was a solid Republican district. But the last member of Congress, who was Silvio Conte, was a liberal Republican, because this tended to be a more liberal area, and certainly with the colleges and the university. But his successor was a Democrat, John Oliver. Now it's a safely Democratic seat. And indeed, all the members of Congress from Massachusetts are Democrats. This was not the case, before the 70s, before this realignment. New England had traditionally been a pretty solid Republican bastion. Not anymore. Connecticut had been a solid Republican. George H.W. Bush's father was a Republican senator from Connecticut. Now, George W. Bush's grandfather was a Republican senator. I mean, Connecticut doesn't elect Republicans anymore because of this party realignment. So getting back to what you were saying originally, what we see now is this political polarization, which is lining up with this ideological polarization. And that's new. But what's not new is ideological polarization per se. Mm-hmm. So you've had ideological polarization, but you haven't had the alignment of that with the parties.
Within party lines.
Yeah, to the extent that we have now. So what we're seeing now is really unprecedented. I mean, what Mitch McConnell did with Merrick Garland was unprecedented.
I was going to ask about that. That was 293 days
right.
of waiting for another Supreme Court justice.
Right. I mean, that was unprecedented.
And moving forward, Democrats are expected to filibuster the nomination of Judge Gorsuch.
Yes.
Is that valid? Can you shed some light on that?
Well, the filibuster has been, at least probably it's going to be ending for the Supreme Court this week, but it's been part of the Senate traditions. I mean, the filibuster will still continue with legislation and a number of different procedural matters. That would be a seismic shift of historic proportions if the Senate were to change and become like the House. Mm-hmm. Because that would go contrary to the intent of the framers and contrary to the whole institutional history. The change of the filibuster rule for voting for the Supreme Court is traumatic for a number of the institutionalists. Not that many left in the Senate. Senator Leahy, who's been in the Senate for 43 years, he's considered the dean of the Senate, one of the foremost institutionalists. But the breaking point has come, and it came when Mitch McConnell did the train wreck, so to speak, with Merrick Garland. And the irony is Merrick Garland is a centrist, moderate to left. His record on civil liberties issues is a very cautious, very careful judge. he's won the respect of conservatives as well as liberals for being such a thoughtful and careful and fair-minded. People on the left were not thrilled that Obama picked Merrick Garland. They would have preferred somebody more of an activist liberal.
Somebody who would protect those civil liberties.
Well, who would be much more aggressive, much more activist, and who would have had a record on this. But President Obama wanted to get his nominee confirmed. And the record was very clear that key Republican senators had praised Merrick Garland, had even earlier in Obama's administration had conveyed that Merrick Garland would be someone they could support. So he had every reason to expect that that Garland would at least, receive a hearing. And his credentials were so superb, and he had so much support from both conservatives and liberals that had it come to a vote, there would not have been a basis.
But political polarization got in the way of that.
Well, it was, McConnell wanted to deny Obama an appointee.
Well, I'm so sorry, but I believe that's all the time we have left for tonight.
I didn't mean to filibuster.
No. Filibuster anytime. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
That's all we have tonight for Professors in Politics with Amherst Wire and UVC TV. I'm Jackson Cote. Have a great night.